avoid the podium until I need to go there. But this is the summary of the paper. There's an 8-page short version in the back, and the citation to the full paper online, which actually has the data and more complete specification of the mathematical tests available. I welcome you to download that. But for follow-along purposes and for CLE purposes, this will give you a summary, and most of the law is in this summary. So if you're just looking for citations to the Stafford Act and to one or two cases interpreting key provisions, here's where we are. Okay, so it literally makes 1 ounce of prevention is worth $1 of cure, literally, when it comes to disaster preparedness. We are so much better off. We get $15 in net present value relative to future expenses in disaster recovery if we would just put the money in advanced planning. Of course, we don't. Why we don't goes to the heart of everything that is wrong with economic thinking about law and public policy. It's a public good because, well, you know, someone else is going to benefit from it, so well, why should I pay up front? It's off in the future, so it's not immediate, and as we know, unless you have zero discounting and no one is superhuman, you never privilege future value and future savings over present expenditures and present consumption. We also know that this is the one thing where we've come to expect. They'll send in the cavalry. They'll always, always take care of us after the fact. Interestingly, it appears that the one constitutional consensus that left and right have had is that whatever disagreements we might have about the propriety of federal intervention in one market or another, there's nothing wrong with fishing people out of the drink after the fact. Okay? Once upon a time, the idea that, oh, we should never have the federal government leading law enforcement, that's completely reversed in the case of a mass storm like Hurricane Katrina. Everyone was asking, where's the National Guard? Send in the Air Force. What? We actually fought a civil war over that idea. And Reconstruction said that's a bad idea. We forget all those lessons when it comes to the immediacy of disasters. Okay, I can go on, but I think the most striking thing is the pattern of federal relief funds. You always find federal relief funds being handed out freely in the wake of disasters. In fact, it's so politicized that we are now able to make certain conclusions from the social science on the distribution of federal relief funds. They, at least half of all agricultural relief payments are political rather than environmental or economic in motivation. It appears that at least the first disaster relief payment during a presidential election season is worth 1 to 2% in the net vote for that state. If it's a close state, that's not a trivial point, right? Okay, so California is already locked in one ledger, but North Carolina isn't. All the things being equal, get nailed by a storm, North Carolina, not by an earthquake in California. All the things being equal, do so during an election year, not during the year after the election. That's terrible public policy. Right? In fact, it's so bad that there is actually a detectable correlation between being a member of Congress in a district that routinely receives disaster payments and going to jail. You're actually more likely to act so corruptly on the flow of federal disaster payments that eventually the United States Attorney catches up with you and puts you away. Now, let's go through and take a look at one set of data on a particular expression of this problem. So let me fast forward here to the Stafford Act. All right, so let's take a look at this very basic data, and I did the usual linear regression just to show you the trend line over time. Okay. So a little bit of actual law. The Stafford Act is the basic federal disaster relief statute, and the truly interesting thing about it is, in theory, it's supposed to be the classic federal intervention is the last resort after local and state resources have been exhausted. So what it takes is the federal government declaring, yep, this disaster overwhelms the resources of local and state governments to cope. We will now authorize a big flow of money to individuals, to governments, everyone who's been affected by it. Now, the interesting thing, legally and politically, is that there's exactly one actor in the federal government that gets to pick. It's the President of the United States. This is one area where you don't need to ask Congress in advance for the money. The money's already been pre-authorized. And what's great from the point of view of the members of Congress is, hey, I get the benefit without actually having to cast a vote. And the president now takes all the credit and or the blame for making the choice. Okay. So you might expect that, sure enough, during election years, it might just be a little convenient to declare a federal disaster, unlocking emergency aid, and suddenly you may find a very heavy governor of the opposite party bear hugging you and saying, thank you, President Obama. Chris Christie and Sandy is the most famous example of this. Among other issues, I think he went a bridge too far, but Governor Christie at that moment had cost himself immense numbers of viewer points on Fox News, if not future contributions and votes in caucuses and primaries, right? This is the kind of thing that does play the political level. All right, so we know from the linear regression that there have been more disasters over time. Now, if I were really doing this in accord with meteorological, climatological, seismological data, I'd actually track the incidence of big magnitude earthquakes, category 4 and 5 storms. I didn't do that. I just did a very crude measure of the number of declarations over time. Generally speaking, it's much more popular. That's not shocking. You see that it works. So politicians keep going back. But what's also interesting, and quite a few social scientists said, we've noticed that the years divisible by 4 aren't just summer Olympiads, they're presidential election years, and they just happen to be peak years. Now, you can't just say that without trying to show it mathematically. But the problem is that if you use linear regression, this is not a strong enough mathematical tool to reveal the trend. So what we'd like to do, let me switch to a different slide here. Oh, where we go? Here. Hey, how about this? This is real environment. This is biodiversity and paleontology. What you're looking at is one very famous study of mass extinction events. And the assertion is that they occur, really big ones are about 60 million years apart. There are smaller ones at about 1/3 of that pace, so 20 million years. How did they get this? How did they come up with that analysis, right? How do you get a cyclicality or a periodicity analysis in this pattern? By the way, 60 million years, you can count backward, but what's 4 or 5 million years when counting in geological time? roughly, in Jurassic World, right? That's the end of the Cretaceous. The dinosaurs disappeared then. If you keep counting backward, you'll find some other big events. The one that no one thinks about, the Triassic. Yeah, but really, really big events happen on a periodic basis. What if we could take this kind of analysis, which happens in paleontology and perhaps less spectacularly in electrical engineering, and apply it to our own data? So, here's the way I propose to go about this. What if we took the linear regression and simply subtracted that out? That would leave this kind of lumpy-looking EKG kind of graph. Okay, generalizing from that, or as a good math geek, I should say, without loss of generality, we could always filter out the direct current component, which here is linear, but it could be polynomial, right? Since the linear case is merely a special case of a higher order polynomial. And what would be left would be a periodic, cyclical, repeating signal. How do we deal with that? All right, I'll show you a little bit of math. But, so there's linear regression. Look how simple that formula is. Oh, now, here we go. So there's the simple formula at the top. That's the general formula for a polynomial. It looks pretty nasty, but look, it's not that bad. All you're doing is adding a constant to a series of polynomials, and they're usually you don't get past the Bordinger-Quinix, so you only go to 4 or 5, and then you're done. And then you have an error term, and that generates. You can do this in Excel without too much trouble, and it generates curvier regressions with the higher order. Of course, the higher order, the less comprehensible it becomes. So you get a good fit, but nobody has any idea what it means. All right, what if we specified the periodic, lumpy-looking part of the data according to a sinusoid? And a sinusoid is, well, like a sine curve or a cosine curve. And you can always, always, always express this in terms of amplitude, frequency, and phase. If you've used a radio, you know those terms, right? The amplitude is the height of the wave, the frequency is how often it repeats, and the phase is where in the cycle you begin. That's it. So what if we actually looked for all of the different little waves that comprise our system? And in fact, this is exactly what you do in music, in electrical engineering, in electronic signal processing, and yes, even in paleontology. So if those disciplines can do it, we too can do it in law. The unfortunate thing is that there's not a package built into Excel to do this, and I had to take a weekend and write it myself. All right, so here's the idea. If it's a sum of sinusoids, how do we break them down? There's the basic mathematics of the Fourier series. The idea is that if you keep looking for a lot of signs, eventually you get it. So imagine this. This is the classic electrical engineering or acoustics class. Imagine a wave that looks a little bit like this. It's called a sawtooth wave, right? That's actually a bunch of sines and cosines put together. A sawtooth wave, if I could duplicate it as a matter of sounds, it's really simple. It's just this nasty saw-like, and if you listen carefully, right, the is repeating itself. It turns out that if you can just keep going, this is actually the sum of a lot of these little waves, and when you add them all up, the sum is equal to the original function. That's it. That's all we're doing. So in law, we have a little issue here, and I'll tell you the technical details of it. After 4 orders, instead of converging, it started diverging. That's not the usual outcome. It does happen. Actually, I can tell you why it happened. The cycle that I was looking for is 4 presidential years. Beyond that, it started adding noise, so I stopped at the 4th order, and this is what I got. Oh, isn't that a much more accurate curve now? Yeah! We actually have a way of picking up the lumps and bumps in the cycle. And in particular, we have 2 cycles going on. We have a Fourier cycle that picks up the pattern of presidential disaster declarations. And from this, the message is very clear. If you're going to get hit by an earthquake or a hurricane, make sure you do it and that you're divisible by 4. If you can, this is an even stronger message, try to avoid getting nailed by a natural disaster in a year whose modulo outcome on a cycle of 4 is 1. In other words, all the things being equal, get nailed by the bad storm in 2016, not in 2017. You wanted to get nailed Sandy style in 2012. You didn't want to wait a few months and take the hit in 2013. You would have lost the federal benefit at the margin. Okay? The other cycle that's in here is apparently there's a 44-year cycle, give or take, in American politics. And if you think about it, from Roosevelt to Reagan and then back to what may be a Democratic ascendancy, who knows, 30 to 40 years apart. This is Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger theory of the ages of American politics. And there seems to be some suggestion of that. The Republican-dominated years of the 80s and early 90s tended to be the years where there were very, very few disaster declarations, generally speaking. But with the return of Democratic presidents, that seems to be a more popular form of intervention. A little harder to establish, but it actually fits the data a little bit better. The problem is that we don't have repeated cycles to establish that. So technical details aside, what lessons do we draw from this? Well, a couple of things. One, when we make assertions in law or in policy analysis about law, we shouldn't just say that. We shouldn't just tell stories. I think we should do our best as scientists to actually dig up the data and use the tools at our disposal. Law is famously, even arrogantly, innumerate. I'm not a scientist. People actually get elected on platforms like that. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who get law degrees and admission to the bar on the strength of, well, I came here because I bombed the medical school admissions test or even the business school admissions test. Don't say that. You're here because you want it to be, and you can use these tools just as well as anyone else. You can look up the specification of Taylor series, Fourier series. This is not impossible. It's sub-rocket science. And everyone in every other discipline has put it to use, so why shouldn't we? So there are some technical details. If you want to tease it out in a question and answer, or talk to me or write me afterward, I'd be happy to address them. But as a first cut, this, I think, is what we should be doing with any data in law that's thought to repeat itself according to election cycles or to correspond to seasonal effects. We do have 4 seasons. We do have changes month by month. These are things that may affect law. And all of a sudden, by combining polynomial, not just linear, polynomial techniques, which we are more familiar with the relatively exotic tools of periodic regression and Fourier analysis, we can really decipher the signal that the law is sending us. Thank you. it's, you start with an R squared. I mean, this is,
Excuse me, could you not only explain the question and then give it to me?
Oh, okay. All right. Sarah's one of my students in environmental economics and markets, so I'm giving her huge kudos here for having nailed the R squared bracket. R is actually rendered as rho, and basically it's a measure of rho is correlation. We'll use R squared as well as squared rho. This is correlation. This is and R squared is called the coefficient of determination. Okay, so what do these numbers mean? What these numbers roughly mean, without getting deep into the Greek, is what they tell you is the relationship between two series of numbers. Okay. So the question is that we have actual observed data, the blue line. That's what's happening in the real world. The orange line is the linear model. All we did was we just drew a line to fit the blue points as best we could. Then I did a lot of math and drew the red squiggly line to try to do that. And each time, the question is, how close did I get to the original data? A perfect fit is 1. A perfect unfit is -1. There is the possibility of a -1 correlation, but not an R squared, because once you square even a negative number, it becomes positive. So R squared is telling you either you've got a perfect fit or a perfect unfit. Okay, and if it's a perfect unfit, you'll see that it's completely orthogonal to it. There's like a perpendicular instead of an alignment. Here we're talking about alignment. They're both positive values for R, therefore R squared. But R squared, all things being equal, is a measure of just how close the model is to the underlying observed data. So it's what's called a goodness of fit statistic. And kudos to you, Sarah, for having read closely. Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing that my R squared statistic to begin with was so weak. And in fact, the Pearson's chi-square test does not land me in anywhere near any of the standard measures of statistical significance. That being said, we still have weak, but not scientifically significant, statistically significant correlation. Okay, so that's the fair answer is it's not. On the other hand, achieving greater fit, and in particular on the mod 4 + 1, basically 1 year after the election, that's a nice finding. And this was the first cut. I can't admit to having run it through every single conceivable goodness of fit test. But Sarah, you want to follow up?
Well, I was just going to ask if there were any further things that you were going to look at to add into the model.
Oh yeah, any number of things I do want to do with this. So I'll take this question of yours as an opportunity to tee off on a couple of things. One is I want more to play with the 44-year alleged cycle. And it occurs to me that it might be best to actually take my own medicine and not apply a first-order polynomial, the linear test in the first instance. I should actually apply a second, third, quadratic or cubic polynomial in the first instance to see that. Given that there's one rise, one dip, that's probably a third-order polynomial. So let me just play with third-order polynomial. But once you play with the third-order polynomial, especially if you've got a single cycle, you may be able to play with a Taylor series and see if the Taylor series approximates a periodic cycle, at which point you bring this back, right? That's what you would do with that. The other thing that I thought of just this week, and it's amazingly painful to do this, was what if we treated this as a financial style time series and played with auto regression all the way up to a Garch type model. So the problem there, that's, in case you're following along, a generalized autoregressive conditional heteroscedasticity model. Scedasticity model, it's a very hard word to say. But that's not something I really wanted to do on Excel. And I haven't cranked up, stat on the road, so I haven't actually cranked that up and done that. But to do that, it would have some really interesting implications for this. What this would do is turn the linear model from ordinary first-order polynomial regression to a drift diffusion model, which is really interesting because then the measure of standard deviation changes from standard deviation divided by the square root of time. And that's just the linear side. Then we have to play with heteroscedasticity. If there is, first we have to determine whether it's autocorrelation. Then we need to scale it up and figure out which order of an arch, let alone a Garch model. You can see that this gets really nasty really fast. However, for that to work, okay, just to answer the question crisply, we have to establish that your likelihood of getting disaster relief in a year is correlated somehow to past years' results in getting disaster relief. That's not something we can actually answer without running something called the autocorrelation function and seeing if it's there. So I have to admit I've not done that. I did think of that earlier this week and just didn't have time to write what would be a second paper putting a completely different set of statistical tests to the method. Oh, and by the way, what you would do is that you would test for seasonality, and that would work for the periodic. So it's there, and I'm glad that you gave me an excuse to tee off on the incompleteness of my own work. Yes, Caroline.
You started on where my question's going to be. We obviously cannot shift when hurricanes happen or tornadoes, but you have information that this is politically motivated. How can we change to make this more of an issue of fairness rather than a political issue?
Well, you publish studies like this and wait for people to do something about it. That's the typical academic approach, right?
I say, but I'm talking about, I don't know if Chris Christie follows you or not. I'm going to guess he may not, so.
No, I don't follow him either on Twitter or anyplace else, but that's okay, so we're even. But Chris Christie, governors and presidents have this propensity to declare disasters or to intervene for political gain as opposed to genuine public necessity or legal obligation. Gosh, that's a terrible thing.
I mean, would you go so far as to say there needs to be a change in the law? Or is it just acknowledgement and awareness?
I think it's, at least in the first instance, it is acknowledgement and awareness that this is a potential for abuse in the Stafford Act system. The absence of judicial review is tantamount to a message from our legal system that if you don't like it, you can vote people out. It's a political solution, right? Anytime the Supreme Court says, well, this is committed to resolution of political branches, that's translation to judicial talk for don't let the very heavy doors of the Supreme Court hit you in the butt on your way out. Because that's what it really is. You're not going to get judicial relief. You can't go into a court and challenge. I'm really offended that the president gave relief to New Jersey right on the eve of the 2012 election. Well, you might not even have standing, right? And even aside from the standing issue, this is one of those questions, according to the courts, committed to executive discretion. Oh wow, it's a political question. It's unreviewable. So realistically, reform would come through the political process, and you could testify in front of the congressional committee. You should really reform disaster relief. I will tell you what I really would do, and this is something we'll discuss in greater length during our class in just a few minutes. I would do this. Imagine a world where you have people knowing that over the course of time they're going to run into expensive emergencies, and that it's cheaper for them to get and put into effect preventive measures all along and get checked up and do good things for them. It's called mandatory insurance. We just came away from a political cycle where, entire elections and Supreme Court arguments and the political standing of Chief Justice Roberts hinges on our willingness to do just that in health insurance context. I do it in disaster insurance. I'd say this: if you don't have flood insurance under the National Flood Insurance Program, which, by the way, we can't bring ourselves to price actuarially. Biggert Waters, left and right, right and left, Biggert's right, Waters is left, got together, worked with the environmental movement and said, yes, we believe in actuarial pricing of flood insurance policies underwritten by the United States. This is a good thing. And since no one underwrites flood insurance policies without the government backup, this is supposed to reform the market. Then the premium notices went out. And people said, what? What? It's triple what I used to pay. It's like, yeah, dude, it's called a subsidy, and it's gone. We're taking it away. You should pay full. Oh, to hell with it, I'm not going to do this. Well, why should I do this if someone's just going to bail me out anyway? Yeah, why should Greece make bond payments to German bondholders if they're going to get a troika payout? This is the problem, and this is why people presented with that issue sometimes like, nine, we're not going to pay. We're not just going to pay after the fact. So we've done this in agriculture, right? The idea is that we've moved farmers, we've tried, we haven't really succeeded in this. We've tried to move farmers to mandatory crop insurance policies and told them, look, you're not insured on all risks. We're not going to give you an after-the-fact bailout. If I had my way, I would actually repeal the repeal of Biggert Waters, restore actuarial pricing to National Flood Insurance Program, and say, look, either you take part or you don't get any relief. And since, of course, you get no relief because you've been flooded out of your home, that doesn't play very well on Fox News or Huffington Post. It's a complete political loser across the spectrum. I know that's a loser later on, so I'll just make them get insurance now, and I've got a great Supreme Court precedent called Sebelius versus National Federation of Independent Business that will let me do just that. So what I would do is I would treat environmental disaster payments exactly like the national health system that we have, and condition participation on the purchase of insurance. Yes, that's right. You gotta buy something that you're not certain you're ever going to use, because you see, it just costs us far too much as a society to pay you after the fact when you're not insured up front. Yes.
I was thinking, like, have you thought about maybe refining your disaster declaration sort of axis to account for like natural, like the actual, basically the natural fluctuations in disasters?
I think that's a good point. One of the difficulties is this, right? I have to take NOAA statistics for the frequency and the magnitude of storms, right? And I would have to come up with a background test of the kinds of things that are covered by the Stafford Act. So we could say, focusing solely on hurricanes, what has been the incidence of hurricanes over this period? Focusing solely on earthquakes, and on the assumption that earthquake damage is a linear or at least a monotonic function of magnitude. Tough to say that, but okay. And the same thing with hurricanes, right? A Category 5 hurricane that happens to strike relatively uninhabited areas is not going to occasion this kind of declaration. So one thing that we could do is we could use insurance data, right, which would measure the economic impact in a much more neutral way, because the insurance companies aren't getting reelected, they're just trying to make profit, and presumably their desire for profit, their greed, does not follow election cycles. So that's a good suggestion. I should follow on that.
I think the agreement does follow the election cycle.
Really? Oh, well, that's a completely different paper. Yeah, that's the Citizens United argument, but we'll say that for another time. Anything else?
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Great,
It
thank
doesn't seem like there are other